Welcome to Simply Stories podcast. This podcast channel is aimed for young, old, and somewhere in between. I read a variety of classics, utilizing experience garnered from my years in the theatre. I'm Robin Coles, and this is Simply Stories. The Reticence of Lady Anne by Saki. Egbert came into the large, dimly lit drawing room with the air of a man who is not certain whether he is entering a dovecote or a bomb factory, and is prepared for either eventuality. The little domestic quarrel over the luncheon table had not been fought to a definite finish, and the question was how far Lady Anne was in a mood to renew the hostilities. Her pose in the armchair by the tea table was rather elaborately rigid. In the gloom of a December afternoon, Egbert's pince-nez did not materially help him to discern the expression on her face. By way of breaking whatever ice might be floating on the surface, he made a remark about a dim religious light. He or Lady Anne were accustomed to make that remark between 4:30 and 6 p.m. on winter and late autumn evenings. It was a part of their married life. There was no recognised rejoinder to it, and Lady Anne made none. Don Tarquinio lay astretch on the Persian rug, basking in the firelight with superb indifferences to the possible ill humour of Lady Anne. His pedigree was as flawlessly Persian as the rug, and his ruff was coming into the glories of its second winter. The page boy, who had Renaissance tendencies, had christened him Don Tarquinio. Left to themselves, Egbert and Lady Anne would unfailingly have called him Fluff. But they were not obstinate. Egbert poured himself out some tea, and as the silence gave no sign of breaking on Lady Anne's initiative, he braced himself for another Yermak effort. "My remark at lunch had a purely academic application," he announced. "You seem to put an unnecessarily personal significance into it." Lady Anne maintained her defensive barrier of silence. The bullfinch lazily filled in the interval with the air from Infagoni en Torridi. Egbert recognised it immediately because it was the only air the bullfinch whistled, and he had come to them with the reputation for whistling it. Both Egbert and Lady Anne would have preferred something from the Yeoman of the Guard, which was their favourite opera. In matters artistic, they had a similarity of taste. They leaned towards the honest and explicit in art. A picture, for instance, that told its own story with generous assistance from its title. A riderless warhorse, with harness in obvious disarray, staggering into a courtyard full of pale, swooning women, and marginally noted bad news, suggested to their minds a distinct interpretation of some military catastrophe. They could see what it was meant to convey and explain it to their friends of duller intelligence. The silence continued. As a rule, Lady Anne's displeasure became articulate and markedly voluble after 4 minutes of introductory muteness. Egbert seized the milk jug and poured some of its contents into Don Tarquinio's saucer. As the saucer was already full to the brim, an unsightly overflow was the result. Don Tarquinio looked on with a surprised interest that effervesced into elaborate unconsciousness when he was appealed to by Egbert to come and drink up some of the spilt matter. Don Tarquinio was prepared to play many roles in life, but a vacuum carpet cleaner was not one of them. "Don't you think we're being rather foolish?" said Egbert cheerfully. If Lady Anne thought so, she didn't say so. "I dare say the fault has been partly on my side," continued Egbert with evaporating cheerfulness. "After all, I'm only human, you know. You seem to forget that I'm only human." He insisted on the point, as if there had been unfounded suggestions that he was built on satyr lines with goat continuations where the human left off. The bullfinch recommended its air from Anfigni and Torridi, and Egbert began to feel depressed. Lady Anne was not drinking her tea. Perhaps she was feeling unwell. But when Lady Anne felt unwell, she was not wont to be reticent on the subject. "No one knows what I suffer from indigestion," was one of her favourite statements. But the lack of knowledge can only have been caused by defective listening. The amount of information available on the subject would have supplied material for a monograph. Evidently Lady Anne was not feeling unwell. Egbert began to think he was being unreasonably dealt, and he began to make concessions. "I dare say," he observed, taking a central position on the hearth-rug as Don Tarquinio could be persuaded to concede him, "I may have been to blame. I am willing, if I can therefore restore things to a happier standpoint, to undertake to lead a better life." He wondered vaguely how it would be possible. Temptations came to him in middle age, tentatively and without insistence, like a neglected butcher boy who asks for a Christmas box in February for no more hopeful reason than he didn't get one in December. He had no more idea of succumbing to them than he had of purchasing the fish knives and fur boas that ladies are impelled to sacrifice through the medium of advertisement columns during 12 months of the year. Still, there was something impressive in this unasked-for renunciation of possible latent enormities. Lady Anne showed no sign of being impressed. Egbert looked at her nervously through his glasses. To get the worst of an argument with her was no new experience. To get the worst of a monologue was a humiliating novelty. "I shall go and dress for dinner," he announced in a voice which he intended some shade of sternness to creep. At the door, a final access of weakness impelled him to make a further appeal. "Aren't we being very silly?" "A fool," was Don Tarquinio's mental comment as the door closed on Egbert's retreat. Then he lifted his velvet forepaws in the air and leapt lightly onto a bookshelf immediately under the bullfinch's cage. It was the first time he had seemed to notice the bird's existence, but he was carrying out a long-formed theory of action with the precision of mature deliberation. The bullfinch, who had fancied himself something of a despot, depressed himself of a sudden into a third of his normal displacement. Then he fell to a helpless wing-beating and shrill cheeping. He had cost 27 shillings without the cage. But Lady Anne made no sign of interfering. She had been dead for 2 hours. The Blood Feud of Toadwater, a West Country Epic, by Saki. The Cricks lived at Toadwater, and in the same lonely upland spot fate had pitched the home of the Saunderses, and for miles around these two dwellings there was never a neighbour or a chimney or even a burying ground to bring a sense of cheerful communion or social intercourse. Nothing but fields and spinneys and barns, lanes and wastelands. Such was Toadwater, and, even so, Toadwater had its history. Thrust away in the benighted hinterland of a scattered market district, it might have been supposed that these two detached items of the great human family would have leaned toward each other in a fellowship begotten of kindred circumstances and a common isolation from the outer world, and perhaps it had been so once, but the way of things had brought it otherwise. Indeed, otherwise. Fate, which had linked the two families in such unavoidable association of habitat, had ordained that the Crick household should nourish and maintain among its earthly possessions sundry head of domesticated fowls, while to the Saunderses was given a disposition towards the cultivation of garden crops. Herein lay the material ready to hand for the coming of feud and ill blood. For the grudge between the man of herbs and the man of livestock is no new thing. You will find traces of it in the 4th chapter of Genesis. And one sunny afternoon in late springtime the feud came as such things mostly do come, with seemingly aimlessness and triviality. One of the Crick hens, in obedience to the nomadic instincts of her kind, wearied of her legitimate scratching ground, and flew over the low wall that divided the holdings of their neighbours, and there, on the yonder side, with a hurried consciousness that her time and opportunities might limited, the misguided bird scratched and scraped and beaked and delved in the soft yielding bed that had been prepared for the solace and well-being of a colony of seedling onions. Little showers of earth mould and root fibres went spraying before the hen and behind her, and every minute the area of her operation widened. The onions suffered considerably. Mrs. Saunders, sauntering at this luckless moment down the garden path, in order to fill her soul with reproaches at the iniquity of the weeds which grew faster than she or her good man cared to remove them, stopped in mute discomfiture before the presence of a more magnificent grievance, and then, in the hour of her calamity, she turned instinctively to the Great Mother, and gathered in her capacious hands large clods of the hard brown soil that lay at her feet. With a terrible sincerity of purpose, although with a contemptible inadequacy of aim, she rained her earth bolts at the marauder, and the bursting pellets called forth a flood of cackling protest and panic from the hastily departing fowl. Calmness under misfortune is not an attribute of either henfolk or womenkind, and while Mrs. Saunders declaimed over her onion bed such portions of the slang dictionary as are permitted by the nonconformist conscience to be said or sung, the Vasco da Gama fowl was waking the echoes of Toadwater with crescendo bursts of throat music which compelled attention to her griefs. Mrs. Crick had a long family, and was therefore licensed in the eyes of her world to have a short temper, and when some of her ubiquitous offspring had informed her with the authority of eyewitnesses that her neighbour had so far forgotten herself as to heave stones at her best hen, the best layer in the countryside, her thoughts clothed themselves in language unbecoming to a Christian woman. So at least said Mrs. Saunders, to whom most of the language was applied, nor was she, on her part, surprised at Mrs. Crick's conduct in letting her hens stray into other bodies' gardens, and then abusing of them, seeing as how she remembered things against Mrs. Crick. And the latter simultaneously had recollections of lurking episodes in the past of Susan Saunders that were nothing to her credit. Fond memory when all things fade to thee, and in the paling light of an afternoon in April, the two women confronted each other from their respective sides of the party wall, recalling with shuddering breath the blots and the blemishes of their neighbour's family record. There was an aunt of Mrs. Crick's who had died a pauper in Exeter workhouse. Everyone knew that Mrs. Saunders's uncle on her mother's side drank himself to death. Then there was that Bristol cousin of Mrs. Crick's. From the shrill triumph with which his name was dragged in, his crime must have been pilfering from a cathedral at least. But as both remembrances were speaking at once, it was difficult to distinguish his infamy from the scandal which beclouded the memory of Mrs. Saunders's brother's wife's mother, who may have been a regicide, and was certainly not a nice person as Mrs. Crick painted her, and then, with an air of accumulating and irresistible conviction, each belligerent informed the other that she was no lady, after which they withdrew in great silence, feeling that nothing further remained to be said. The chaffinches clinked in the apple trees, and the bees droned around the berberis bushes, and the wandering sunlight slanted pleasantly across the garden plots, but between the neighbour households had sprung up a barrier of hate, permeating and permanent. The male heads of the families were necessarily drawn into the quarrel, and the children on either side were forbidden to have anything to do with the unhallowed offspring of the other party. As they had to travel a good 3 miles along the same road to school every day, this was awkward, but such things have to be done. Thus all communication between the households was sundered, except the cats. Much as Mrs. Saunders might deplore it, rumour persistently pointed to the Crick he-cat as the presumable father of sundry kittens, of which the Saunders she-cat was indisputably the mother. Mrs. Saunders drowned the kittens, but the disgrace remained. Summer succeeding spring, and winter summer, but the feud outlasted the waning seasons. Once, indeed, it seemed as though the healing influences of religion might restore to Toadwater its erstwhile peace. The hostile families found themselves side by side in the soul-kindling atmosphere of a revival tea, where hymns were blended with a beverage that came out of tea leaves and hot water, and took after the latter parent, and where ghostly counsel was tempered by garnishings of solidly fashioned buns. And here, wrought up by the environment of festive piety, Mrs. Saunders so far unbent as to remark guardedly to Mrs. Crick that the evening had been a fine one. Mrs. Crick, under the influence of her 9th cup of tea and her 4th hymn, ventured on the hope that it might continue fine, but a maladroit allusion on the part of the Saunderses' good man to the backwardness of garden crops brought the feud stalking forth from its corner with all its old bitterness. Mrs. Saunders joined heartily in the singing of the final hymn, which told of peace and joy and archangels and the golden glories, but her thoughts were dwelling on the pauper aunt of Exeter. Years have rolled away, and some of the actors in this wayside drama have passed into the unknown. Other onions have arisen, have flourished, have gone their way, and the offending hen has long since expiated her misdeeds and lain with trussed feet and a look of ineffable peace upon the arched roof of Barnstable Market. But the blood feud of Toadwater survives to this day. Thank you for listening to Simply Stories. A new show will be posted every week from a range of literary greats. If you enjoyed the show, please tell your friends and subscribe. You can also check out our sister channel, News of the Times.